Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Shift Book Club. I'm Sam Baker, and I am delighted to welcome Sharon Blackie, author of our October Book Club pick, Wise Women, Myths and Stories for Midlife and Beyond, to the Shift Book Club Live. Sharon is an award-winning writer, psychologist, and mythologist, which is the best job title in the world, who is passionate about reimagining what it means to be an aging woman in our society. Her first book, If Women Rose Rooted, was an ecofeminist sleeper hit about finding your place in the world that was passed furiously from hand to hand, woman to woman. She followed that up with Hagitude, reimagining the second half of life, which we were actually just saying is kind of like a companion piece to Wise Women, really. And in Hagitude, Sharon asks what aging as a woman in the West might be like if we actually embraced it and saw it as an adventure, not something to be dreaded. Now, Sharon has, is actually, am I going to say, I was going to say you collaborated with the storyteller Angharad Wynne. Is that correct?
Is what correct? The collaboration?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, Angharad was a storyteller, so it was a question of seeing whether she could put some kind of storytelling input into the book.
Sorry, I'll just, another arriver. Okay. Now Sharon has collaborated with the storyteller Angharad Wynne on our Book of the Month, Wise Women, which retells myths and folk tales that seek to redress the balance by celebrating the wisdom and power of women in midlife and beyond. At the heart of all three of Sharon's books is one radical idea. What if older women knew how to use the power and influence that many don't even know they have? What if we recognize our value and wrote our own narratives? And by the way, Sharon also has an excellent Substack, The Art of Enchantment. Welcome to the Shift Book Club, Sharon. It's lovely to see you.
And it's lovely to be here, and yeah, really looking forward to the conversation. I have to say, it's my sixth book, not my third, but
Oh,
there are a couple quite a couple in between.
oh, fill me in quickly.
Okay, so my first one was a novel, The Long Delirious Burning Blue, or what my husband calls The Long Delirious Burning Title. Then,
Yeah,
then there was
great.
If Women Rose Rooted. Then there was The Enchanted Life, which was another non-fiction book about the concept of enchantment back in 2018. Then there was a collection of fairy tales, reimagined fairy tales called Foxfire Wolfskin, and other stories of shape-shifting women, and then Hagitude, and then Wise Women.
Wow, prolific. Before we get into the book, if it's all right with you, I'd like to talk a little bit about you. And I should tell everybody that Sharon gets up at 4 a.m. So what looks like 7 p.m. to us is about 10 p.m. to Sharon. So if she starts drooping, that's why.
I'm
Um,
all drooping. That's why I've got my glasses on. My eyes are kind of goggled at the moment. So
what is the 4 a.m. wake up time about for you?
Really, it's kind of where my body clock is. I mean, it's as simple as that. My body clock has just grown earlier as I've grown older. But also, I love the magic of it. I love that idea that I get up at 4 o'clock. The dogs are still sleepy. My husband's still asleep. It's particularly in the winter when it's dark, and you just have this sense that you own the world. You know that there's nothing impinging upon you. That you can do anything at that time of the morning, and it's dark, and there might be stars, and I can just do my best writing when that happens, and I love it with a passion.
It's really interesting, isn't it? 'Cause I often feel like I like the idea of it, but the reality of that, especially this time of year when I don't know, I mean, you're Cumbria. I mean, we're looking at, you know, 8 hours of daylight up in Scotland. So that will get down to 6 in, well, a month.
I guess so, but it's not really going to make any difference, you know. So you're pretty much getting up in the morning in the dark and going to bed in the dark no matter what. And I think it's probably different for me because I don't have kids, you know, there's just the two of us. And so it's easy for me to go to bed at 8 o'clock. Nobody really notices. I mean, clearly I can like push the boat out every now and again if we go out, but it's not a kind of big family thing like it would be for people who had kids and what have you. So it's easy to arrange. And it just suits me. Everything works when that happens.
So tell us a bit about your early influences. Where did your passion for folk tales and fairy tales come from?
Came really right back from when I was a child. And like many of us, I had a fairly complicated childhood situation. It wasn't great. I grew up in a very impoverished environment with an alcoholic mother and a violent father, and it was kind of shaky sometimes. I had family around me at the time, which was helpful. And when I say I escaped into fairy tales and folk tales, it wasn't really an escapism that kept me there. You know, I didn't go there to just find myself in a different place. I went there because what was magical about the fairy tales is that you started off with this archetypal impossible situation. Every fairy tale heroine at the beginning of the story is in an impossible situation. And by the end of the story, she's out of it. And she's normally got herself out of it with the help of other people or other than humans, the wisdom of a crow or a bunch of hungry mice or whatever. And in community, she has completely managed to transform her impossible situation into something that's hopeful. And that really did actually hit home with me when I was a kid. And I could see, and it was kind of a learning experience. It's like, "Oh, that's how you might do it. You might make these friendships, or you might employ these behaviors. You might have to work hard. You might have to do the housework that you didn't want to do." And when I later became a psychologist, I found that really a lot of the kind of techniques that I was encouraged to employ with my clients, cognitive behavioral therapy, very effective in some ways, but nobody's going to get excited about them. If you tell them a story, though, you've absolutely captured people's imagination. And if you can capture somebody's imagination and help them see what a transformation might look like, then you've kind of semi-solved the problem already. So the heart of it has always been transformation. That's what they are to me.
Did you have a favorite as a young girl?
I don't know that I had a favorite story. I had several favorite stories, but my favorite character, I never, I grew up in a council estate in the northeast of England. There weren't very many golden-haired simpering princesses there, to be honest.
Yeah.
So I didn't much relate to those characters, but I was surrounded by a bunch of very, very feisty old women who pretty much ran the community. And I always wanted to be the wise old woman, as I thought that they were the ones that were very much more interesting. They were the ones with the power, actually, and they were the ones also with the insight. They knew what had to shift, sometimes what had to break to make a situation worse and so better. And so I always kind of more identified with those characters, and I don't know whether I was kind of, looking forward to my own elderhood, but those were kind of the characters that I was related to more.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, you've written a lot about, and you only have to read a fairy tale or watch a Disney or, Pixar or whatever to see that it's the young people, it's the young girl, it's the young boy who are always, always the hero. So it's interesting that your identification went to the kind of the older, the more what's the word I'm looking for? Uh just say reactionary, and it's not the word I want at all. Sorry, I'm having a very menopause moment here with my brain. But the transgressive, I guess, character.
Yeah, the ones that were not always what you would expect and perhaps a little bit ambiguous, so they weren't always nice. And to me, that's kind of the essence of menopause onwards. Being nice is no longer a life goal. And I think that's probably a good thing for many of us, for many
Mm.
women who have it kind of instilled in us when we're young that we must be nice at all costs. And then you go through menopause and all of that is broken down and burned away. And it's not that you have to come out of it just being unpleasant, but it's not your motivating factor anymore. And I think what interested me, and I think I saw some of that even as a child, which is a bit weird really, but then maybe I was a weird child. That sense that it's not a free ride. Life isn't a free ride. You've got to, if you want to succeed, if you want to get out of the archetypal impossible situation, then you've got to work hard, you've got to do the apprenticeship, you've got to be kind, you've got to be respectful. And I liked the fact that those old women kind of embodied those values. I mean, it sounds very traditional now. I don't really have a problem with that. I think those are good qualities for life. There are others as well, compassion and so on, but those are a good starting point. And it just kind of all made sense to me when I was younger, in a way that very little else did, frankly, around me.
So when did you professionally start to blend the psychology and the mythology?
Not probably until I was getting on for 40, to be honest, because I had a side track into neuroscience. I was an academic neuroscientist for a while, coming straight out of my psychology degree. And so there was no real room for story there. And then I took another detour into corporate life, which I wrote about in If Women Rose Rooted, which was just mad. But that's what you do sometimes when you're in your 20s. And so it really wasn't until I was probably on my third midlife crisis, when I was about 40, that I finally managed to break free of all of that and figured out who I was supposed to be and what I was supposed to do. And so I retrained in some areas of psychology and began to practice kind of what is effectively narrative psychology, which is the use of kind of storytelling and other narrative techniques. Again, with the aim of helping people to see different iterations of the story that they think they're living and try to persuade them sometimes that actually, they're in a different story, or they could change the story or whatever.
I've been thinking a lot, especially the last week or so, about, we say that we have to, tell ourselves different stories than the stories we've always told ourselves, the stories that we were brought up to believe. But before that comes the fact that we're told the stories, doesn't it? Whether it's like you said about being the nice girl, the good girl as a child. So it's, the stories that are coming from our families, it's the stories that we're reading, you know. So it's almost like if we could change that from an earlier age. I realize that's a big ask. You'd be changing the situation in which a lot of us find ourselves. So when you were what I'm really interested in is the fact that you read the same fairy tales as everybody else, but you took something different from them. And I think that's what I'm trying to get at is how did that happen? How did you not think, oh no, I'm not I want to be the princess and I'm not? How did you think I want to be the kind of competent old woman or the wise woman or because you were told the same stories as the rest of us about what has value.
Yeah, I mean, buggered if I know. I don't know.
Sorry, that was the longest question
No,
as well.
no, no, no. It made sense, and I just don't know. Is the easy answer? It's just the way that's just the way it was. That was what captured my imagination. And kind of more recently, I've kind of regressed a bit, and now I'm very interested in the fairy tale heroine's journey, which I've been working with a bit on my Substack, and also that'll be the subject of my next book, and looking back at those young heroines and what fairy tales tell us about how to live a good life. Um, I don't like words like succeed, so let's think about just how to live a good life. And there is so much in there, and a lot of it is about values. It's about the values that you bring. And fairy tales, and this was always in some sense clear to me, and I just thought the older women kind of embodied it. Our fairy tales tell us a huge amount about the importance of relationship and reciprocity because these are not when you have a fairy tale heroine, these are not heroes' journeys. This is not about swashbuckling glory, individualism. It's about community. She only can win through in relationship with community by giving something back, literally, to the tribe of hungry mice who'll help her sort the seeds when Baba Yaga or whoever tests her, to the point of death. and giving them a bit of her porridge when they're hungry or whatever. And it sounds very simplistic, but it's not. If you look at the average fairy tale in its whole, that's what it's teaching us. It's teaching us to respect animals. It's set in the natural world. Of course, it would have been back in the day. They didn't have the kind of technology that we have, but it's very much about finding your way through relationship and community. And I think that that is so important a message for today when we seem to have lost that in so many ways. And a lot of the times, it's the older women in the stories that are kind of teaching that are showing the way to be in kind of balance and harmony with the world. And that's what I kind of saw, I think. I mean, clearly, I'm looking back from the perspective of very, very many decades now, but I think I saw that those older women were just they were kind of complete in themselves. It wasn't that they knew everything, but they were all right. They were okay. They were doing okay. They were sorted. And then they were helping young people be sorted. I kind of like that. Maybe that's why I became a psychologist. I don't know.
So tell us about your own um, aging and menopause journey. I mean, what was happening in your life at the point when you started to look, I suppose, for, I hate the phrase role models. It's right, as you say, it's right up there with succeed, but you started to look outside yourself for guides, I suppose, in this kind of storytelling world.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never really been impressed with the kind of role models that the culture had offered me. I don't think. Not that, and by that I don't mean that there aren't some amazing women out there. Of course there are, but I just never felt that the culture itself really knew what to do with women. And clearly, that fed very much into if women rose rooted and taking back that sense of who women are and what our power is. And then I got to 50 and I was kind of fortunate and not in the sense that I had had endometriosis for most of my life and I was on the pill, which was the only thing that could control it. Literally the only thing that could control it. And when it was uncontrollable, it was not pretty. And so I'd always said to my doctor, when I'm 50, I'm coming off the pill and then I'm just going to take whatever happens, because clearly there were health risks. And so I came off the pill at 50. That was it. Clearly menopause had been happening in the background. Now, it was a bit of a car crash in some ways, in the sense that, you still have the psychological changes, you still have the instant hot flushes from the withdrawal of the hormones and all of the rest of it. So I'm not suggesting that it was easy, but it was different. And so I came out of this at 50 thinking, what the fuck? And what now? What am I supposed to be? And I had a very strong sense that I wasn't going to do HRT. I was lucky I didn't need it. I wasn't having mood swings. I wasn't having physical symptoms that I couldn't live with. And I had a very strong sense that I wanted to kind of grow old in what I thought of as a natural way. I'm not suggesting everybody should do that, but for me, that felt important. I don't know why. And so it was just like, okay, so I am now going to get older pretty quickly. I'm going to let that kind of big transformation happen, which is that transformation between the story of the first half of our lives and the story of our second half of our lives. What is that story of the second half of my life? What am I supposed to be now? And you look around, and again, the culture doesn't offer you any stories at all for what it is to be a useful, authentic, um, contributing to society older woman. It's what I wrote in Hagitude. We know all about elderly, but we don't know anything about elder and what it is to be elder. And so and when I guess because of what I've said, um, the importance of these stories ever since I was a child, when I don't see anything good in the culture, I tend to go back to the old stories to see if there's a trick we might be missing. Sometimes our ancestors knew more than we did. And I was just wondering, well, I wonder if they tell us anything about what it is to be an interesting, sometimes funny or feisty older women. And so that was the work that began. It's probably been about 6 years now that I have been looking through European myth and folklore for stories of older women. And Hagitude was kind of, if you like, the first installment of that. And Wise Women is the next installment with the stories written in full and very many more of them than I had when I was writing Hagitude. And I was just gobsmacked at the number of older women that I found and at the diversity of their character. You know, that there were so many different ways of being a really interesting older woman. And so that's kind of when it started. I was just I was looking for inspiration for what I might be supposed to be.
I mean, I think it's really startling reading Wise Women because you think about, or certainly I was thinking about, the representation of older women in fairy tales, and you're very much looking at, you know, wicked witches eating children for breakfast and, evil, jealous queens, and occasionally kind of a cuddly fairy godmother. But, those are the kind of the representations that spring to mind. And then when you start to read Wise Women, there are so many, so many different representations. And you're still very much in, well, a lot of them are British, but certainly in a European world. Do you think the representation would be better? I mean, not that it's that we are well represented in Wise Women, but do you think the representation of older women would be better if we could go outside the white Western centric storytelling world?
Yeah, undoubtedly, but that's not very I don't find that very helpful because we are in the West, and I think it's really important for us to find women from our own lineage. Um, a sense that our ancestors from here had something to tell us. That's just always been very important to me. I think there are times when you can go to other cultures for wisdom, but generally speaking, only after you've made yourself completely certain that you haven't already got it here. And I think that's a mistake that we have made here in the West. And I wrote about that at much more length in If Women Rose Rooted, that we turn to the East for wisdom or we turn to Native Americans for wonderful stories that they have about living in balance and harmony with the land. And yet we have them here. And nobody was talking about them at the point where I wrote If Women Rose Rooted back
Mm.
in, I was working on that in 2015. It's like, what, here, here? And, I've worked with Native American elders who are delighted by the fact that we have exactly the same kinds of stories that they have here. It's just that we've been taught to look at them differently. We've been taught to look at them as, entertainment for children rather than teaching stories or cosmology as they have been. So to me, delving into our forgotten Western tradition is really, really important. Also, it's just a courtesy thing. If I read a Japanese story, I can think it's very, very beautiful, but I don't feel that I have any right to interpret it because I don't know what a particular image means to Japanese culture. And for me to come out and, say it means this and we should take this from that story, it just seems a bit kind of disrespectful. And so there's part of it which is just a kind of natural sense of wanting to kind of talk about what I know. But yeah, within that tradition, there are very, very many stories already. And, I haven't necessarily in any way got the monopoly on them in Wise Women because, yes, I mean, I was in many ways constrained by what was available in translation. And not all cultures in Europe have got great bodies of folklore translated into English. So you're restricted to what you can speak, and I can speak French, so I could find a couple of stories from there. Or, what has already been translated, as opposed to in Britain, clearly there are volumes and volumes and volumes of kind of stories in English and from Scotland and from Ireland.
I mean, the oral tradition is really important here as well, isn't it? I mean, particularly in the kind of folk tale, folklore, the handing down of those stories.
Yeah, I mean, it was always in the oral tradition, and in the oral tradition, in most parts of Britain and Ireland and most parts of Western Europe, it's not exclusively always so. But generally speaking, folktales were the province of women, and the kind of academic field of fairy tale studies is increasingly demonstrating this. So it's not just a nice idea that I've cooked up, there is kind of evidence for it that women were telling these stories to other women while they were doing weaving or spinning or whatever it is that they were doing, while they were doing domestic work. Clearly, there are some stories that are aimed at kids. Clearly, there are some places where men had a similar function, but almost always it's women talking to women. And these were working class women. And so, working class women back in the day knew a whole bunch of stuff about challenging situations, which is why, one of the reasons why I think that they're so helpful to us. It's just like they went through all of this stuff. And we've lost that really. What happened was, particularly in the 1800s, um, a lot of male, mostly, again, not exclusively, but male folklorists started to collect the stories. There was kind of a fashion for it and began to write them down in books. And then as soon as they became kind of trapped in the pages of a book, it's like that's the oral tradition gone. It's dead. It's in a book. So the story that's in the book must be the real one. It's kind of biblical in a sense. It's like that's the word. You can't change it. And except in certain parts of Europe, the oral tradition died out. I'm kind of fortunate in a way because I spent a number of years um, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland and also in the Gaeltachts of along the west coast of Ireland. Probably about maybe 10 years in total, where the kind of storytelling and the oral tradition is still very much alive, especially in Ireland. And so I kind of saw that still working. But one of the things about Wise Women is I really did want the stories to I wanted to make the stories simple enough rather than kind of go off onto one of my kind of like super literary riffs, so that they could be told as well as read, because that there's a power in keeping them alive in that way, I think.
And it was really interesting that I think it's right at the end. You say that you say, it's not enough just to read the stories and to see um, the different ways to be an elder. It's, you need to tell those stories, you need to pass them on, you need to kind of keep them alive. And I think that's a really interesting point because I don't think that we do that necessarily.
No, we don't. And storytelling, I mean, there's been a great revival in the kind of performance art of storytelling over the past 10 years, but most of us are not going to become performing storytellers or even, go to storytelling shows. And I think that kind of informal storytelling, which is what would have happened back in the day, is something that we've lost. And we saw that very much in Ireland. So we were in a culture, particularly in Donegal, where, if you went to, I'm not sure that this would necessarily work in a smart North London dinner party, but there, if you kind of went for dinner with some friends or whatever, they just say, do you know a story or can you sing us a song? And you'd end up going around the table and somebody, if they couldn't sing, they would, tell you a poem or they'd remember a kind of story that they had heard when they were a child, or you would sing a song or somebody would pull out a fiddle or, whatever it was. And there was just this sense of it was kind of a natural part of the culture. It wasn't kind of nobody was kind of in any way overawed by it or felt the need to perform. It's just like it was just a sharing of culture, and it still happened. And we started to do that ourselves, and it was brilliant because everybody knows something. And that's the kind of environment. Actually, I don't know why, but you can do that today. And everybody will know something. And that's the kind of environment that I'm thinking of, that it's kind of informal, where we say, do you know that story? There's an old woman in Northumberland, a story about an old woman in Northumberland who did this and it's funny or whatever. And then they come back into consciousness again. And people hear them and they have different expectations of older women as a consequence.
Yeah, when I was reading, I was particularly looking at the Scottish ones just because I'm here and I'm really interested in the Scottish culture. And when I I went to see pantomime last year for no reason, no kid, just went. The pantomime The Ice Queen, and they had it was in Edinburgh, and they had made it Scottish as opposed to Scandinavian, and they had converted the Ice Queen into Vera,
Right.
and and I had never heard of her until then, and I still didn't really know much about her until I read about her in Wise Women, and it's just those stories that underpin our culture but are just lost. It's fascinating. I just want
Yeah,
to
and
say to
that's
every sorry to interrupt. I just want to say to everybody, I'd love to know. Amy's actually already popped one in. And Di, who can't be here tonight, has sent me one. But I'd love to know if that there are any stories in Wise Women that particularly resonated with you or spoke to you. So do pop them in the chat if there are. Sorry to interrupt you, Sharon.
No, not at all. I was just going to say, yeah. I mean, it was really, so half of my family is Scottish. My dad's family are all from Edinburgh and still in Edinburgh, and so kind of that was a place that I spent a huge amount of time as a child. And so it was the stories of the Cailleach. For those of you who don't know it, the Cailleach, one of her names is Bera in the Lowlands mostly, but the Cailleach in Scottish Gaelic and Irish literally means old woman, and she is the old woman who is the creator and shaper of the land. And those stories really were what set me off looking for older women in folklore because I knew, I already knew that there were interesting old women that weren't being talked about in the culture, apart from the wicked witches and stepmothers that you mentioned, Sam. And it's just like I knew that there was this woman called the Cailleach or called Bera or Callie Berry in Northern Ireland, and it's just like she made the land, and we have no idea who she is. And so it was kind of a passion for those lost stories of older women that really set me off on that research project with Hagitude, and then um, you know, had gave me the idea for the Wise Women collection.
So Wise Women is divided into 8 sections. How did you how did you choose them and how did you kind of divide the stories out into those sections?
Well, it's kind of that's the psychologist in me, the depth psychologist in me, which is always looking for kind of archetypes and always looking for classifications. And so it's just like, I'm looking for what is the essence of this story? What is this old woman doing in this story? So there were very much older women who were mentors of younger women who had gifts kind of to give to younger women, whether that be the gift of care or the gift of showing them that hard work is necessary, whatever it might be. Then there were clearly older women who were um, personifying the earth or weather or the natural world in some other way. There were older women that you really wouldn't want to mess with, that you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley on a dark night, and yet nevertheless had something very important to teach us about pushing us to the brink. And so it just seemed kind of, as a kind of Jungian depth psychologist, it's kind of natural to me to look at those kind of archetypal qualities and kind of classify them in that stories that I'd found in that way.
And Amy has mentioned, and in fact, I made a note of it as well. I think it's the very first story, actually, the fox story, the story arc of separation, initiation, and return, which I absolutely loved that. And it was not something that I'd read about before. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's one of the stories that to me is the perfect example that I always use of why fairy tales do actually matter and do tell us something about our lives. Because this is an old Siberian story about a woman who basically has been married to a man for a very, very long time. He leaves every morning. Spends the entire day away, comes back in the evening. She still, after all of those years, has no idea what he's doing. And one day she just can't bear it anymore. So she follows him, and to cut a long story short, she finds that what he does all day is he sits in the middle of a forest on a log, and she looks at him and thinks, "What on earth?" And I don't know this man, I don't know my life. She leaves, she runs into a giant who has a giant will, picks her up, slings her over his shoulder, runs with her to the top of a mountain, dumps her in a cave, and then buggers off again. And it's just like, what am I doing here? This wasn't quite what I had in mind. And then while she's kind of weeping and wailing, she hears a voice say, "Look up and you'll find the skins of land birds above you." She looks up, there's a coat of crow feathers. Tries to put it on, but it's too small. So she weeps and wails again, and then she hears the voice again say, "Look up and you'll find the skins of land animals above you." So she looks up, and there's this lovely orange fluffy thing. She pulls it down. It's a coat made of fox skins, puts it on. Everything fits. Everything is wonderful. And again, to cut a long story short, by the time she's escaped from the cave and got back to her village, she's a fox. She's done the transformation. The transformation has happened. But the nature of the transformation is such that when she thinks, "Oh, I'll take safety in my father's house, don't quite know what to do, what's going on, I'll go back to my father's house, and then I'll take safety, find safety there." Every time her head tries to poke through the door, her wild fox body turns her around, won't let her go in. And in the end, she runs off across the fields to whatever new life might lie beyond. And that story to me, excuse me, son, I've got a bit of tickle in my throat. And that story to me tells us that midlife, something always has to be left behind. You always have to leave something behind. You have to necessarily leave your husband, but you always have to leave something behind so that that new story of the second half of your life can start. And also, it's evidence of the wild woman archetype kind of rising up in us, which I think it does for all of us at menopause. You can't ignore the body at menopause. You just can't, you know. You could try, but it's not really going to work. And so there is that sense of bodily wisdom, but really that just something's got to shift and something's got to shift big, and there's a big transformation coming, and it might be really beautiful. And that story to me is just pure magic, and that's why I wanted to open the book with it.
I think that when you just said it might be really beautiful, I thought we are never told that.
No, we're not. And isn't it
We are
really, really,
never told that.
yeah. And it
We
is
are
often,
just, sorry.
no, I'm agreeing with you. It is often, isn't it?
Yeah, and we're so, we're told, as you said, in Hagitude and in here, we're told so often to be afraid of it, that there is no variety of paths once you reach this point. You know, there's pretend it's not happening, or there's embrace it to the extent that you just curl up in a corner and that's your lot kind of thing. And I think it was so fascinating to me that, however far back that story originated from. I mean, if you've got any idea how old for instance, that story is.
No, that's a Siberian one, so it's kind of sketchy. You know, they weren't written down until, and very sporadically. There's only one English version of that, I think, actually. So that would have been a Siberian. It would have been very, very old.
Yeah, and and now we are, starting to talk about menopause. I mean, you and I have talked about it before, and people like me are talking about this transformation as if, not as if we discovered it, but as if it's a revelation,
Mm.
which it is. And you said, jokingly, you don't have to leave your husband, but so many people do.
Yeah.
That kind of and I speak to women in their early, at the beginning of the journey in their early 40s, and already saying, they just want to, I think Annie McManus said, I just want to set fire to something.
Yeah. And that's kind of what it's designed for. And as you say, that's when nobody prepares us for that. We're prepared for an ending. That's all. Menopause will end your fertility. It will end your sexuality. It will end, everything that you once thought defined you. But nobody says, okay, then what? Then what? When everything that you once thought defined you is stripped away, then what? Then what's the story? Literally, we are not told even that there is another story. We're just told about the ending. And that really pissed me off when I got to 50. I wasn't having that. I knew that there was more for me to do. And I think it's so important that we find that, because there's no question, I think, but that whole conglomeration of midlife through to menopause is a messy, messy time for all of us. And I do think it's designed to be, because you've got to let some things die for something new to be born, if you'll forgive the cliche. And that's what's going on here. And if you can just get through it and let that kind of magic work on you, I think many of the problems that we face are because we're fighting it, you know, the whole
Mm.
process of transformation, and it's going to happen anyway, whether we fight it or not. And what comes, I've spoken to so many women who, when they've got through it and come out the other side into elderhood, the clarity, that was what it was for me. It was just all of a
Mm.
sudden, the sheer clarity after all that hormonal nonsense had gone. And you realize how your behavior and your perspective and everything has been controlled by hormones for years, and then all of that's gone, and it's just like, this is great.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When do you think that the kind of wise woman vanished from our culture,
Oh,
Western culture?
I don't know really. I mean, I think, like, clearly our ancestors, the older women didn't have They didn't have economic power. They didn't have, in some ways, they didn't have social power. It was still very patriarchal. And yet they had community power. They had power within the community. And that's very clear in all of these stories. And it was clear in the northeast of England, in the working class environment when I was growing up in the early 60s. They still had it. They still were the kind of moral voices of those communities. I mean, I had a great aunt who, with her hair in rollers and a kind of hairnet over it, and her pinny and her, kind of arms crossed over her ample bosom, would stand on the front doorsteps of her house and just it would be a running commentary for whoever went by. And again, it sounds fairly comical, but it mattered, so according to the values of that day, if someone was pregnant and wasn't married, they would get a mouthful. If somebody had been drunk, and breaking the place up the night before, he would get a mouthful and she would be listened to. And they'd go away kind of, and kind of think again. And that power was interesting. It wasn't always kind. And again, it was very much according to the values of the day, and it wasn't always pretty, but it kept a sense of responsibility alive that I think has gone now pretty much everywhere, certainly gone in the places where I grew up. So I think a lot of it did persist until relatively recently. And whether that's the wise woman or the powerful older woman, I don't really know, but I don't think it's been gone a long time. What about you? Do you see that? And did you have that when you were a kid? Sense of that?
Well, I don't know that I did so much, but I was thinking this, and I'm aware even as I'm about to say it, how it's probably going to sound. And for Laurie, who's American, Coronation Street is, if you don't know, is a soap opera which has been going in the UK for, I mean, oh God, I don't even know how long, since the
60s, early 60s, yeah.
60s, 60s. And when I was a kid, so in the 70s and 80s, it was peopled by the kind of women that Sharon's just described.
Ina Sharples, I'm sure, was
In,
based on my Aunt Meg.
yeah,
Image of Aunt Meg. Yeah.
yeah, it's Ina Sharples, Hilda Ogden. The pub was, there was Elsie Tanner. The pub was run by, uh, can't remember, is it Annie?
Can't remember now myself
Betty
either.
Turpin worked in the pub, but there were a lot of middle-aged women, middle-aged and older.
And they were
And I,
funny, weren't they? Yeah, they were
yeah,
funny.
they had a lot to say, but but also they weren't comic characters. They weren't the
Mm,
butt of the joke.
yeah.
And I was at my parents' last week for reasons I won't bother to go into, and watched Coronation Street with them. And I swear there was probably one character over 30
Mm,
or maybe 35. So all of those women, those matriarchs, if you like, all gone.
yeah. Yeah. And
And
I
that
really do think it's very,
backward step.
yeah, but very much a backward step. Yeah. And so, we think it's kind of been lost for like 1,000 years or hundreds of years. It hasn't actually. I think it's very recent. And, there are so many changes in society. And in the North, for example, there's no question. I mean, we're getting slightly off topic here, but there's no question it was kind of, Maggie Thatcher destroyed the communities by taking away the mines and the industry. And there was no work anymore. So there was no working class ethic. And everybody just like, it just all literally all went to hell in a handbasket. There was nothing, there was no community. There were no values to protect anymore. And so you just kind of see a kind of dissipation of everything. And it just cultural changes really, I think, have done it for us. The big cultural changes of the past 60 years, particularly.
And Ellie makes an interesting point as well, which says that do you think this is more true in communities where there are fewer men, fathers around? Like I live in Liverpool, which is a fiercely matriarchal society, but I think this is out of necessity more than design.
Probably. I mean, I think what's interesting is, that if I look back at my great Aunt Meg and her sisters, they came into their own during the war, during the Second World War, when all the men were away, and they had to keep everything going. And you saw that throughout Britain and throughout Europe, I'm sure, where women had to step in, and they were finally able to kind of, step into those roles. And for a long time, they weren't going to let them go again. But then another shift, and it's already gone.
If anyone's got any questions for Sharon, do just pop them in the chat box for me. That would be great. Um, you talk in the book in one of the introductions, I think, about the fundamental distrust of women as we age. And I think there's a German quote, which is if the devil can't come himself, he sends an old woman, which reminded me very much of I've been reading quite a few books about witches lately, as you do. And it reminded me very much of that, those notions of witchcraft that prevailed in the 16th and 17th century. That, I mean, it ties into what we've just been talking about, but where do you think that fundamental distrust comes from?
I think it's a complicated phenomenon actually that began kind of when particularly patriarchal forms of Christianity overtook some of the older traditions where women were would have been the center. So in Britain and Ireland, certainly, and in some parts of Europe, the kind of pre-Christian pagan cosmology, women were very much at the center of it. That's not to say that women, kind of like real life women, had a huge amount of social power, but women were at the center of it. They were the moral authority of the universe. We had all of these older women like the Cailleach who kind of made and shaped the land. If you go back even further to the Greek tradition, you've got the three fates, who were three old women who literally kept the world in balance. They wove the world into being, not men, but older women. And then you come in with a particularly patriarchal form of Christianity, which was the form of Christianity that eventually prevailed. And their God was an old man in their vision.
Mm,
Of course, he wasn't, but that's how they kind of thought of their God, and there was no room for a woman. And you can see it, and particularly in figures like the Cailleach, and particularly in the Irish tradition, which has a lot of writing, very early kind of stories written down. You can literally see it happen. You can see this powerful old woman, great grandmother goddess, gradually becoming a wicked old witch and eventually just becoming a silly old woman. You can trace the Cailleach stories to see that, and I think that distrust of the female, of everything, that distrust of women and of imagination, of intuition, and all of the things that we think of as feminine qualities, and the fact that they were superseded by the rational and the intellectual. I think it was frightening. I do think it was frightening. And the idea of older women, their power, whatever that might be, unleashed was a threat to kind of, the world order, such as it was at the time. And that's why you begin to see that mistrust of older women on the edges, on the fringes of their communities, which led to the witch trials.
sorry, my brain just flatlined and I was about to ask something. Oh, I know what it was. The There's a lovely phrase in the book I really like called the Council of Grandmothers,
Yeah.
which tell us a bit more about that.
Well, that's kind of another kind of Jungian idea that I've worked with when I've done workshops, and it's this idea that that when we're kind of looking for who to become, particularly in menopause, and we're looking at kind of we're looking at what I called in Hagitude. We're looking to develop our own inner hag, who we are, how we uniquely embody elderhood. The kind of idea that there are a collection of these older women that we will be drawn to, and their stories that we'll particularly be drawn to, and that we can kind of extract them from the stories and work with them as characters in a kind of imaginal way, that we might imagine that they have some wisdom to offer to us. What would the Cailleach, maybe the Cailleach would be one of your council of elders. Maybe the wolf, the fox woman that we were just talking about would be one of your council of elders, and that you could almost engage in imaginal dialogue, which is very much a Jungian kind of practice, a practice in Jungian psychology for kind of cultivating the imagination and working with kind of guides that you would kind of collect them together, and you would literally, you would find some way of representing them, and you would consult them. You would have a conversation with them in your head or whatever from time to time to see what they might have to say to you outside the context of the story. So I always call that a kind of council of grandmothers.
And actually, if you look back at the kind of the section you've divided into the kind of 8 categories, who like together they do make up, don't they? A kind of. the kind of guides, witches, mentors, the hags that represent the seasons, the formidable old woman, the visionary, the elder, together they do make up a kind of an incredible kind of, well, yeah, council of grandmothers.
Yeah, and there are some days, when you need to channel your inner Baba Yaga, and Baba Yaga might be the one to tell you how to do that. And there are some days when you need the advice of some of the just, there are some lovely, just nice older women in the book, in these stories. So they're not all powerful goddesses or witches or whatever. A number of the stories that I found and some of the ones I particularly love were just really kind old women who really valued what they had, which was little, but they knew when they had enough, and sometimes we might need to hear that in our lives. So yeah, I kind of like the idea of a kind of collection of advisory older women from the
Yeah.
stories.
Oh my God, how fantastic would that be? I mean, the the final category, which is death and rebirth, it reminded me. I mean, it's again what you were saying about, the notion of God as this kind of old man with a big beard. And it reminded me of the poet Selena Godden has written a novel called Mrs. Death, Mrs. Death,
Oh yeah, all right, yeah.
where she reimagines death as, you know, a kind of a late middle-aged, older black woman. And it just struck me as the same thing, this notion of death as a masculine, destructive, ominous force. And who said?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that book. I quoted from it in Hagitude, and there's a classic example of what you're talking about, which is in the Grimm's collection of fairy tales, there is a character called Godfather Death. And Godfather Death is a bit kind of, I can't, we don't have time to go into the whole story, but Godfather Death is kind of, judgmental. You don't mess with him. You don't try to trick death. Otherwise, death will come down upon you like a ton of bricks, and you'll suffer. And Godfather Death is a very cold, kind of calculating character in the Grimm story. And I found a Moldovan, I think, I can't remember now, but somewhere like that, kind of further east, version of that story, which was Godmother Death. And Godmother Death is quite the opposite. She is working under the same constraints. People clearly still die. She is death, but she is compassionate. She explains to people why they must not trick her because that person is going to die anyway. And in the end, the characters, rather than being kind of carted off by Godfather Death and his cold, icy demeanor, they die in her warm arms. And it's just such a really interesting contrast. And really, we see in many of these stories older women as kind of midwives. And so the final story in the book is in Wise Women is another Siberian story about an old woman who lives clearly in the land of the dead, underground, populated by skeletons. She sits by a fire, surrounded by skeletons, and again, to cut a very long story short, she's brought the bones of a dead hero, and she burns the bones to ashes, and she sleeps on the ashes of the dead hero's bones for 3 days and 3 nights and brings him back to life. So that sense of rebirth as a natural part of the process is absolutely tied up with all of the stories. Very few, but the few stories that I found about death.
There's a great question from Ellie, which I'm just going to read it to you. Um, Obviously, you're a woman who's drawn to the land, to being outside and absorbing the wisdom of the earth. Do you think this has become important for increasing number of women in midlife? And she's thinking of the growth in popularity of wild swimming, for example, and almost without, and I would agree with this too, almost without knowing why women in midlife do seem to be drawn to the land, to wild spaces. And that's her experience, and certainly a kind of any affinity with nature has certainly been my experience too. Until I was probably 50-ish, I didn't even see it. And yet, do you think that for you is that connected with midlife and menopause and
Yes, it is because and it's kind of going back to the foxwoman story again. I really do think that for women much more than men, clearly men have a kind of story of the first half of their lives and a story of their second half of their lives, and they're different. But for women, we have this big punctuation point of midlife and menopause where we go through profound physical transformations. Our body is changing. I mean, it's changing in a way that it won't have changed and since menarche, which is again a radical transformation. You just think of, from a physiological perspective, what's happening to your body, and it's happening again in menopause. And so the whole process brings us back to our body. And I think there is an insecurity in that process. It's frightening when you see that going on. And I think a lot of women kind of instinctively find grounding in the land. I think a lot of women don't know that they're doing it for that reason, but it seems to me that it's almost like a clutching at something solid, which is the earth. And the earth, of course, changes and goes through cycles and seasons. And it kind of we're drawn to it because I think it shows us, it kind of teaches us that this is okay, this is a natural process, this is what happens in physical incarnations. And of course, the land historically in our culture has always been associated with the feminine. And so it's natural, I think, that women would be drawn to it at points of real big transformation. And yeah, it happened to me as well.
We could easily be here all night, I think. Do you feel like now you've written Hagitude and Wise Women, do you feel like are you done with midlife or is there more
Yeah.
to do?
Yeah, I think I am actually. Certainly for now. And in my next book, I'm actually turning back to the first half of life, um, and looking at those fairy tale heroines when they set off. And it feels a little bit full circle. So I feel as if I'm almost stepping into the role that I saw myself in as a kid, which is kind of, I'm not saying I'm the wise old powerful woman in the fairy tales. That would be silly. But nevertheless, that whole idea that when you get to a certain age, you feel more confident about going back to the beginning and saying, okay, not just here's what I've learned, but here's what might help you get through it. And that's classically what the older women do in fairy tales in one way or another. And it's kind of ironic in a sense. I think I've probably come to that stage right now.
Yeah, into your elderhood.
Kind of, yeah, yeah.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. Thank you for staying up. Just want to remind everybody that in fact, I've got a proof, so it's not going to show anything. The Our next book club is Paula Hawkins' The Blue Hour, and Paula will be with us. I want to say December the 11th. Don't hold me to it. Give me a second. No, December the 10th, which is a Tuesday. So make sure that's in your diary. Um, Thank you, Sharon. You can go to bed now. The rest of you
Thanks a lot.
can't go to bed. It's much too early. Um, Thank you and good night, everybody.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much, Sam. Always lovely to talk to you. And thanks to everybody for being there.
Good night.